Were witches real? No. We can all go home now. So he writes this at the end of the 15th century, and he's like, yeah, man, witches are women who are just so sexy. Oh my God, they're so hot. And then they have sex with the devil. Oh my God, they're doing it with the devil. What were witches accused of? Mate. One of the big ones is making men impotent, because you know what witches do? They're sitting around thinking about your junk. So the Salem witch trials, for example, were connected with some young girls who were basically acting out, right? So weird behavior, storms, illness, sad peepees, and also sometimes stealing peepees. Hi, I'm Dr. Eleanor Janega, and I am a medieval and early modern historian with a specialism in magic, which is why I am super qualified to yell at you all today about Google's most popular questions about witches. So let's get into it, shall we? First question. What are witches? Depends on who you ask, homie. Because witches now could be our good friends who are practicing various religions like Wicca, or, even kind of practices that they come up on their own. Witches historically is usually a term we use for magical practitioners that people with power don't like. So witches more particularly often relates to women.
Sabrina's a witch.
And it can sometimes happen to be applied to men.
You're a wizard, Harry.
I'm a what?
But these are usually people who are seen to have been practicing magic with malicious intent. And even particularly in an early modern context, what we will tend to say is that these are people who made a pact with the devil, and they went and had weird orgies with the devil. Oh my God, there's so much talking about weird orgies. Like, I'm not even joking. It's like half of the literature on it. And then they, as a result of said orgies, get the powers of the devil in order to, like, I don't know, man, wither your crops, curse your livestock, wither your junk. There's a lot of worrying about withering men's junk, things of this nature. So it's kind of an imaginary category that was created by people in order to get rid of people that they find to be unlikable, or, just kind of like inconvenient. Now, this isn't to say that people who called other people witches didn't believe it. They almost certainly did. But it is also just like kind of an imaginary term for people who weren't really doing anything wrong. So it really depends on whether or not we're talking about a witch in the witch panics in the 17th century, or if we're talking about your friendly neighborhood witch now.
Yep.
So not all terms work for all people. Be very, very careful who you're talking about. Were witches real? No. We can all go home now. There were no pacts with the devil. I don't know how to be the one that breaks this to you, but no one was having an orgy with the devil, because that's not real. Now, that doesn't mean that people didn't think it was real, but who thought that this was real? Okay, so the guy who kind of like comes up with the idea of all this is this guy who writes the Malleus Maleficarum, or the Hammer of Witches, a guy called Heinrich Kramer. And my man was a straight up weirdo. So he writes this at the end of the 15th century, and he's like, yeah, man, witches are women who are just so sexy. Oh my God, they're so hot. And then they have sex with the devil. Oh my God, they're doing it with the devil. I'm not even joking. That is like literally what this book is about. And everyone was like, wow, Heinrich. Seems like you are an interesting guy who has a lot of problems. And like this book kind of gets written and everyone just kind of like tries to walk away slowly without making eye contact. But 100 years later, the idea of witches has got more popular and more popular and more popular. And then everyone is like, oh man, Heinrich was onto some real stuff. We gotta go get the Malleus out. And then everyone is like, I feel like witches are absolutely getting it on in my back garden. No, they weren't. Like that's not a thing that happened. But what happens is that there's like a cultural creation of the idea of a witch as a result of this. So people really start believing that it's true. And up into the fact that sometimes people think that they are witches. So we know, for example, from the Pendle witch trials here in England, that some people who are accused of witchcraft think they actually might be witches. Accidentally. There's a woman who accidentally curses someone and then he falls down and like has a fit. And then she's like, uh-oh, I guess I'm a witch. And there's a reason why that you would understand that, right? Because it's difficult to not think that there's a cause in relation to things that happen. And also, if you're in a society that says witches are real, you might think that that's true about yourself. But fundamentally, no, witches were not real. They were just a bunch of people who were persecuted, often poor and often women. And it actually tells us more about what the prejudices of a society were more than what people were actually doing. Next question. What do witches look like? So, this is a question that is really interesting because the iconic idea of a witch as kind of like a haggard old woman riding on a broomstick was actually invented by one guy. It's called Albrecht Dürer. And Albrecht Dürer makes this really cool engraving of an old woman riding backwards on a goat called the Witch. And it is like iconic. Like this gets out in the world and people are like, oh hell yeah, that's what a witch is. Which is super interesting because earlier on when we would see pictures of women who were magical practitioners, oftentimes they were sexy ladies. There's a really great late medieval painting called The Love Spell, where there's a real sexy chick who's naked and wearing very cool heels, which I would like to buy. That is like the older idea of magic practitioners. So, you know, the kind of a sexy lady. But it turns into this idea of like a haggard old woman who is doing bad things just because she hates the world, right? And it's really from Albrecht Dürer onward that we get this idea, and that later gets augmented with, you know, pointy hats, things of this nature. But the oldness, the wrinkledness, and the broom are all inventions from Albrecht Dürer. When were witches invented? This is such an interesting question, actually, because the figure of the witch certainly exists for a very, very long time in European culture. So for example, if we look at ancient Greek stories like the Odyssey, you can 100% say that people like Circe are witches because they are women who are practicing magic in a really malevolent way, right? So the minute you are turning sailors into pigs, I guess that's bad. But you know, there's this idea that there might be women who are kind of like doing magic in the wrong way that exists for a really long time. And certainly throughout the medieval period, there was an idea that people might be doing magic or women might be doing magic. But also, especially in the medieval period, they're like, honey, you're not doing magic. You think you are doing magic. And it's actually seen as sinful that people think that they might be able to do magic because they're like, no, you can't. Only God can do magic. Who do you think you are? You're just some chick, right? So sometimes you would get people who had to get brought before priests because they thought they were doing magic. And you're like, you need to say 10 Hail Marys. You've been very bad. Magic's not real, right? But then in the early modern period, people get really, really into the idea again, and they start to believe that witches are kind of all around them. So it's an interesting one because this figure, this idea of a woman who is doing bad magic has sort of always been present in our society. It's just whether or not we believe in them that changes. Next question. Where are witches? If you ask people during the witch panics, in your closet, under the bed, next door, up on Bald Mountain. That's a big one, up on Bald Mountain. Apparently they're having orgies up there. Look, it's not my fault that they keep writing about orgies. I'm not the one who made this up. But yeah, you see witches kind of pop up all over Europe in all kinds of different places. You get witches in Iceland, you get witches in the German lands, you get witches down in Spain, witches in Hungary, you better believe there's witches in Hungary. And it even eventually ends up coming to the Americas along with Europeans. So witches can really be anywhere. And indeed, you know, the practice of witchcraft as a religion is something that happens all over the world now, and that's totally fine. But we also have to be super careful with that when we talk about it, because there can be some places sometimes where people are still persecuted for the idea of witchcraft. And no one is turning into a cat and blighting your crops. That's not real.
Oh, come on.
So we still see that belief of the witch as a malevolent person kind of pop up all around the world. But basically, it's an idea. And those ideas can happen anywhere, and so witches can happen anywhere. Were all witches women? No. And this is a really interesting thing. There are places where it's often more likely that witches are women. In particular, in the German lands and in England, you see women be the real targets of these witchcraft persecutions. Sometimes there are men involved in that as well, but it's just at a smaller number. But in certain places, you see an equal number of men and women persecuted for witchcraft. So for example, in Sweden, the witchcrafts are almost 50-50. But then you have outlier places like Iceland and Estonia, where it's mostly men who are killed for witchcraft, not women. And we think that maybe this persecution of men is more tied with places that have a stronger folk tradition of the idea of wizardry. So, you know, if you are in a place that has been founded by Vikings, former Vikings, you might think it's more likely that men are the ones who are doing all of the magic, because if you read the Icelandic sagas, there's rather a lot of men who wield magical power. But women are killed in larger numbers in America and in kind of continental Europe. So there's no real one way to talk about witches. It depends on what society you are in. Because we are speaking English right now, we tend to focus on women because English society persecuted women in greater numbers. But there still were men who were killed as well. Was witchcraft a crime in medieval times? It's really much more of an early modern problem, witchcraft. Yeah, it is a crime in the medieval period. Very occasionally, you see people who are killed for witchcraft, but usually if you're killed for witchcraft, you're real highfalutin. It's like ladies and things like that. So if you are a woman who has accumulated rather a lot of money and power and you people off, occasionally people will be like, I don't know, man, witchcraft? And then you can get got. But witchcraft is usually seen throughout the majority of the medieval period as not real. It's an imaginary thing, and if you think you're doing witchcraft, you are deluded, and it is more of a religious issue, so it's something that the church would deal with rather than the state. And it can be kind of seen as heretical if you're doing it, so you might be killed for heresy. But really, witchcraft is not a thing for medieval people in the way that it is in the early modern period. And that is something that people kind of have a little bit of a difficult time getting their heads around. Witchcraft is really tied up with kind of like the invention of Protestantism, actually. So from the 16th century forward, so the 1500s forward, we see this thing that we call confessionalization. And that's when Catholics and Protestants are basically in an arms race with each other to prove who is more holy. And one of the ways they prove that is more holy is they're like, those guys harbor witches. No, those guys harbor witches. No, I'm gonna kill witches. No, we kill witches more. And so you suddenly have this really big emphasis on finding and killing witches. So really, witch panics are something that modern people do. It's not something that medieval people do. And they do occasionally kill people once in a while for witchcraft, but nowhere near the numbers that modern people do. And this can kind of make us uncomfortable because after all, we're modern. This is something that we don't really want to think about ourselves, but unfortunately, baby, we got only ourselves to blame. What was the Witchcraft Act of 1604? Oof, a bad idea. So again, 1604, right? This is modern. We are nowhere near the medieval period at this point in time. And this is an act that's brought out that makes it a state and capital crime to do witchcraft. This is kind of happening because at around this point in time that royals decide witchcraft is happening. A couple of reasons for this. You see your boy there, Henry VIII, wanted a divorce from Anne Boleyn. And it was sort of like, well, homie, didn't you just want a divorce from Catherine? And he was like, yeah, no, but I was really horny for Anne Boleyn. So she was a witch? Question mark? And that was like one of the things that Anne Boleyn is accused of. That's one of the things that ends up getting her killed. Here's the thing. If the king is like, yeah, I was horny and now I'm not, and that's witchcraft, then everyone has to be like, yeah, witchcraft is real? Question mark? At a state level, right? You kind of have to like go along with this cosplay, and it becomes like more important and more important and more important. Now, this gets really solidified under James I, the King of England, or James VI of Scotland, depending on who you were asking. Homeboy was a huge believer in witches, to the point that he wrote a whole book about it called The Demonarium. And he was absolutely convinced that there was a conspiracy of witches who were out to kill him, usually by bringing up storms on the sea when he was crossing the channel. It's a bit wild. He thinks he's more interesting than he is. But he brings out the Witchcraft Act of 1604 in order to make it legal to kill witches. And this is how you can tell that this is a really modern phenomenon, because it's a modern thing to say the king is going to look into stuff like this. In the medieval period, witchcraft and whether or not it was real, that's usually a matter for the church. But as the modern era progresses, the state begins to do more and more things. And in particular, what James wants to do is hang witches. And that's basically what the Witchcraft Act allows him to do. Next question. Were witches evil? Well, witches weren't real, so jot that down. I mean, not really. The idea of the witch is evil. That's the difference, right? So the idea that James I has in his head of the witch is evil. Yeah, the idea of what a witch is someone who is evil, who's in league with the devil / having sex with the devil, and is doing all kinds of weird magic as a result of the fact that they are just bad people who are evil. But the thing is, that's not real. That's not actually something that ever existed. And so that idea of the witch as evil is real, but witches as evil are not. All of the witches who are killed during the witch panic are just people who were in the wrong place at the wrong time. There are people who got on the wrong side of people. There were people where there was some advantage to kill them, or people who were seen as just being a problem. Just because you are a problem to rich and powerful people does not mean that you are evil. It doesn't matter what James I has to say about it. So the answer is the figure of the witch and the idea of the witch is evil, but the people who were killed because they were seen to be witches were not. Next question. When did witch hunts begin? So things really start to gain steam in the 17th century. Here in England, that is really connected to the Witchcraft Act of 1604. And that gives you a legal way of hunting witches. You know, you can't just like go round up a posse and go annoy like your local medicine woman before this. You need to have some laws that say it's okay to do that. And you need to have a social structure that says that that's acceptable. And so, especially in the 1600s, we see lots and lots of people get accused of being witches. So you have a legal framework, you've got a social framework, and you've got a religious way of thinking about witches that coalesces at this point in the modern period. So the witch hunts are a really big 17th century thing in particular. That's when you're gonna expect to see them. Next question. What were witches accused of? Mate. So all kinds of things. It really depends on who you're asking. One of the big ones is making men impotent, because you know what witches do? They're sitting around thinking about your junk. That's, ooh. So anytime someone's pee-pee was sad, sometimes like a woman would get accused of like cursing them. That's a really huge one. I'm not even joking. Just because I like to say sad pee-pee doesn't mean that I made it up. All right. But another big one that you would get accused of is blighting crops. So if a harvest doesn't go particularly well, witches were accused of having done that. Similarly with bad weather. Really big thing about storms coming in and people blaming witches for that. So James I in particular, he was mad on saying that a witch must have caused this big old storm, right? Witches are also accused of cursing people and giving them various sicknesses or illnesses. This comes up particularly when we see witch panics in the Americas. So the Salem witch trials, for example, were connected with some young girls who were basically acting out, right? And so people said that the witches had cursed the little girls. So weird behavior, storms, illness, sad pee-pees, and also sometimes stealing pee-pees. There's a whole thing in the Malleus Maleficarum about how like they'll magic your junk off and put it in a nest and feed it oatmeal. Look, it's not my fault that people wrote about that. I'm not making this up. But then there are practical things that witches are accused of that mean that real people who are doing real things get killed. So for example, we see witches accused of performing abortions. And this has real knock-on effects for midwives. So in the medieval period, you know, abortions are nobody's favorite thing, but they're kind of like in a gray area where in the first trimester, it's like, yeah, sort of you might have one of those. But with confessionalization and Catholics and Protestants trying to prove to each other that each one is more holy, people start liking abortions less. And so the women who are providing them oftentimes get accused of witchcraft. And if you're the sort of midwife who performs abortions, then they might say, oh yeah, and also she's switching out the babies that are born with demon babies, a normal thing to accuse someone of. And so there'll be all kinds of knock-on effects from there. So sometimes the things that people are accusing witches of are completely made up, like disappearing wee-wees. Sometimes it is like weather phenomena or sickness, things you can absolutely see. But sometimes witches are actually just being accused because of the healthcare that they provide. So it really depends on the circumstance and who's getting accused. Next question. Why did people accuse witches? All sorts of reasons. So in the first place, people get accused of witchcraft because people are completely convinced that they have been cursed by a woman. So in the case of the Pendle witch trials, if a woman says, I am cursing you because you won't give me pins, and then you fall down and have an epileptic fit, you can kind of understand why you might accuse someone of witchcraft, right? That's one kind of tragedy. Sometimes, in particular, like when we look at the Salem witch trials, people who are accused of witchcraft often have a lot of land and money. And if you plead guilty to witchcraft, which you're usually going to do because they've usually been doing some torture to you before you go on trial, all of your lands are then forfeited to the state and can be redistributed, right? So there is a real monetary reason why some people are accused of witchcraft and some people aren't, right? But other people accuse witches sometimes if it's a woman who has scorned you. That's a big one. If a woman is simply too hot and you accidentally are the king and divorced your first wife about her, but then she doesn't give you a son, you might accuse her of witchcraft. Henry, talking to you. So, you know, it really, really depends. There's personal beef, there's monetary gain, there's being scared that women are too sexy. There's all sorts of reasons that witches are accused. It might just be that you are a nice local woman who gives abortions to people when they need them, right? These are all there in the handbag, and it really depends and varies from accusation to accusation and place to place. A lot of people were accused, a lot of people were killed, and there's different reasoning behind all of it. Next question. Who was the Witchfinder General? Ooh, so this is a fun one because this is an appointed role that you can have under James I. You yourself can be the Witchfinder General, and he is like the sheriff of finding witches. So, you know, this is the person who's kind of like appointed to go around and crack down on all of those witches. You know, think about it as like one of those like bad cop movies, and he's like, that's it, he's a renegade that doesn't play by the rules. No one agrees with his methods, but he gets results. Like, that's the Witchfinder General, right? But the important thing to remember is this is an actual government position. And this is someone who is tasked with rounding up, finding people and putting them on trial and seeing them hanged for witchcraft. So there's more than one Witchfinder General because technically that's just a position. That'd be like saying who's the sheriff. But the most important and famous Witchfinder General was Matthew Hopkins. He features in one of my favorite pictures of all time where he's like going into some old ladies' houses and they show them all their familiars. And the familiars are like cute little guys with names like Pie Wacket and Vinegar Tom. Justice for Vinegar Tom. I don't think he did anything wrong. But yeah, some people are more famous than others, but you could be the Witchfinder General and, you know, you're not a household name. Next question. How were witches identified? Torture. That's a big one. You know, a woman would kind of get rounded up, or, you know, a man if it's Iceland, and you would get tortured and asked if you were doing witchcraft. And I don't know if you've ever been tortured. I'm trying not to be, but you will agree to basically anything. You know, if someone says, oh yeah, are you a witch? Were you having sex with the devil while you're on the rack? You might be like, yeah, man, all the time, just to get this over with. There are other things that people might do in order to say that someone was a witch. For example, they would look for moles on the body, and they would say that that is what is called a dark mark. And the idea of a dark mark is that it was a kind of nipple that your demon familiar suckled from. So it would need to be in like some random place, especially if you had like moles around your junk or on your bum. They'd be like, haha, that is where the demons suckle from. And so that is one way of doing it. But you absolutely do not have to have that in order to be accused of witchcraft. It's just kind of like a useful expedient for the people who are looking for witches. But yeah, torture, a really big one. Sometimes the ducking stool, more particularly, especially in the Americas, although not always. The ducking stool is also just a way of torturing women who are a little too mouthy at times. So the torture varies, but torture is one of the really big ones. Yeah, it's not very cheery. Don't know what to tell you. Next question. What happened to accused witches?
You are all hereby found guilty of the crime of witchcraft. I sentence you hags to be burned at the stake until you are deemed fit to re-enter society.
Fire it up, boys.
Really depends. If you are then found guilty, which many people were, usually you're hanged. Common misconception that witches are burned. Some witches are burned, but burning is usually very specifically associated with people who are heretics. So that comes more from like the Catholic angle of things. And if you are a witch, you are a heretic, but that's not usually how things are done. Hanging is the #1 way that witches are killed. Sometimes people who are accused of witchcraft die under torture. So in particular, we have examples from Salem where people were very slowly pressed to death with stones when they refused to admit that they were witches. And they died that way, which is a really horrible way to go. But the major way that people accused of witchcraft who are found guilty are killed is hanging. Next question. Did witches float or sink? See, this is one of those things. It's really linked to the idea that one of the tests for witches was this kind of like drowning thing. That's linked to, again, the ducking stool. The ducking stool is a mechanism where you have a chair at the end of a pole, and it kind of goes up and down over a body of water, and you would submerge someone and then bring them back up again. It's kind of like the early modern version of waterboarding. It's a form of torture, and people would say, yeah, never mind, I'm a witch, I don't want to die this way, just hang me, or something, by the time you brought them out. But there's kind of this common rumor that people would be thrown into bodies of water, and if they floated, they were witches, and if they sunk, they were not. And so this being like, oh, well, if you die an innocent, then that's kind of okay, and it's like better than that, or whatever. But if you floated to the top, then they would hang you. And there are some cases where this happens, but it's not widespread. It's not the number one way that witches are identified. Generally, it's other forms of torture, and it's more like, the rack, pulling out fingernails, all of that gross stuff. So yeah, there's all kinds of ways to torture witches, but if they're doing the throw you in a body of water one, you would float if you're a witch. Next question. Were witches left-handed? There is a thing where people who were left-handed could be accused of being witches. But this is very similar to kind of like the dark mark thing, where it's like if you had been already pointed out as someone who was maybe a witch and you're left-handed, they got you. Got your ass, right? It's one of these things that would be considered bad. Just because you're left-handed doesn't mean that you're going to be accused of being a witch, though. If you're a rich and powerful man that everybody likes and you're left-handed, nobody cares. That's absolutely not going to have anything to do with anything. But if you are a super poor woman who has like off the local constabulary for God knows what reason and you're left-handed, yeah, they might bring it up. So it's really a case-by-case basis. And hilariously, this is also kind of linked to the word sinister. So sinistra means left in Latin. And so the idea is that if you're doing things with your left hand, it's sinister. And that's like the witchy thing about it. So basically, not everyone is, but if they got you in their sights, they might use it as an excuse, yeah. Next question. How many witches were killed? We don't really know, because here's the thing about a panic. People be panicking, right? And it's difficult to say. Sometimes you hear like really weird inventions about this where they're like, it was millions of people. No, it wasn't. But it's not a good number. Let me just tell you that. It's kind of safe to say that we think like maybe around 30,000 people were killed, somewhere in that ballpark. But we don't always have great records for everything. And we don't always know who might have been killed by a witch if it's kind of like extrajudicial. If people just kind of like round up in posse and they decide to lynch someone, we're not necessarily going to have a record of that. So there's going to be people who've like fallen through the cracks as well. But yeah, tens of thousands, which is not particularly cheery. Next question. Why do witches have big noses? So this is again down to your man Albert Dürer there. And he has this image of the witch, the old witch, who rides goats backwards. And why the witches have big noses is kind of just an effect of aging. As we age, our noses kind of get larger, they keep growing, things start moving around. And so that's kind of associated with old age. And because old age is associated with witchcraft, especially after Dürer comes up with this image, that's when the noses kind of get passed down. It's also just a way of being shady and saying, oh, if you're ugly, you're a witch. I mean, I'm not telling you that these people are particularly creative, right? So it's just kind of like a way of being a hater, and more particularly being a hater to old people. But that's all down to your man, Albert Dürer. Next question. Were witches midwives? Sometimes. So there's a common misconception that all midwives were killed as a result of the witch panics. Absolutely not. Midwives are an absolutely indispensable part of medicine in the early modern period. And hell, now, shout out midwives. We love you. So midwives are the major way that people get medical care across the board. If you live in a tiny little village, you are probably not going to have a local physician. There's going to be a midwife that makes sure that babies get born and who takes care of your cough, right? And so this is going to be the medical practitioner for most people. The midwives who are killed are midwives who perform abortions. So if you are a midwife who never performed abortions, you were absolutely fine. However, if you did perform abortions, you could 100% come into the crosshairs of people who were looking to kill witches. So yes, some midwives were killed, not all midwives, and in fact, the great majority of midwives were absolutely fine. Did witches brew beer? Probably, because most people brew beer. It was a cottage industry at the time, and more particularly, women were the ones who were brewing at the time. Everybody drinks rather a lot of small beer and small ale. It's non-alcoholic. They don't do it because they simply love to get drunk, and they don't do it because the water is bad. They do it because it's kind of like an energy drink at the time. If you were working 12 hours in a field every day, you would want as many calories as you could get. And so people were constantly drinking beer, and witches were constantly thought to be brewing beer sometimes, but it's not because they were witches, it's because they were women, right? So this is a feminine thing. It's about feminine labor. And now there's this thing where they're like, oh, well, the broomstick is because when you made beer or made ale and you had a new batch on and were selling it, you might put a broomstick outside to advertise it. That's absolutely true. But that's not what the broomstick's about. The broomstick is about that it was phallic. So it's a dick joke. So we're kind of retroactively being like, oh, this is all about brewing. And yeah, I mean, witches brewing beer might have been a thing, but it's just because they were women, not because they were witches. It's a feminized form of labor, and it's one of those interesting things that's really changed now. Now we think that beer is for men, but no, it's for the ladies. And me, more particularly. Go get me a beer. Okay, thank you. Next question. Who were the Pendle witches? The Pendle witches were a really unfortunate group of people starting in about 1612 who get accused of witchcraft. Most of them come from two families, and the most common last name of the people who were killed is Device. So it's the Device family. This is one of those weird cases where something actually happens, where one of the Device women comes across a man who is kind of like a traveling salesman. And now, according to her, she asked to buy some pins off of him, and he refused to kind of take them out of his bag because it wasn't a big enough sale. According to him, she demanded that he give her pins for free. One way or another, she points at him and says, I curse you, and homeboy falls down and starts having an epileptic fit immediately. And she's like, I'm a witch. Oops, I didn't, and he's like,
oh, she's a witch, damn.
And basically all hell breaks loose from there. So you have this kind of family that all gets caught up. There's also like some esoteric stuff that goes on. They're trying to figure out what to do, and they end up like having a big meeting, and then they steal somebody's sheep and have a barbecue, and then like stealing a sheep is a hanging offense. So there's like all kinds of weird things that are happening. But also what happens with this is that there's a couple of judges who are hanging out up in Lancashire. It's a kind of like real rural, really far away from London type place, and these guys want to make names for themselves. So they try these witches, and then they also produce pamphlets that are like,
Found some witches! Found some witches, everybody! Hey, ho, ooh, look at me! I'm the guy who found those witches, and I got them all hanged.
and it basically makes them stars, and they get to leave Lancashire and move down to London. So it's a really unfortunate kind of perfect storm of people who did kind of do something vaguely witchy, and people who are trying to make a name for themselves. And so it's a lot of people who end up getting killed for really nebulous reasons. It's incredibly, incredibly sad. What were the Salem witch trials? The Salem witch trials were a series of witch trials that take place in, you guessed it, Salem. So basically what happens is two young girls start acting out and acting up. They're yelling in church. They are twitching. They're screaming. They're doing all kinds of weird things. And everyone is like, girls, what is wrong with you? And they're like, we were cursed? Question mark. Guess who gets accused of being the one who cursed them? That's right. It's the enslaved person who is either of African extractive or Carib extraction. So, you know, the Native Americans that lived in the Caribbean. And like, surprise, oh, she's a witch and she cursed the nice little white girls. But this begins to spread, right? There's a panic that sets in that, oh, people are going around cursing other people. Oh my gosh. And it builds and it builds and it builds. And in Salem, everyone is just accusing each other. And oftentimes the people who are getting accused are people who have a lot of money that the state stands to gain from. So in particular, the way that the Puritans had written all of these laws was that if you pled guilty to witchcraft, the state got to take all of your land. So if you were kind of cantankerous and had rather a lot of land, odds were you were about to get accused of witchcraft. And the other thing is, again, we have a man who's attempting to make his name here. There had been a new posting of a new preacher there in Salem up from Boston. He doesn't want to be in Salem. He wants to be in Boston. You know, bright lights, big city. But, you know, ooh, well, here's a way to make a name for yourself. Accuse every single person all around you of witchcraft, and you're the guy who rooted it out. So it's kind of like a PR stunt that goes wrong in a way. But lots and lots of people are killed. And Salem is very, very important. And it's talked about a lot because, well, it's an American example, and Americans do love to talk about themselves. But also because it's one of the last really big ones, because by this time, most people had moved on. Next question. Was Giles Corey a witch? Giles Corey was not a witch because witches aren't real. But more particularly, Giles Corey is one of these people who gets called in on the witch trials because nobody likes him, and he's very, very rich. But Giles Corey becomes very, very famous because, yeah, he's cantankerous, but he's also stubborn as hell. So he absolutely refused to plead guilty to witchcraft because he didn't want to forfeit his lands to the state. He wanted to make sure that his children were going to get his lands. And he was very, very slowly tortured to death as a result of this. They did this by putting planks of wood on top of him, laying him on the ground, and then putting progressively larger stones on him to crush him slowly over a period of days. Homeboy was so stubborn that he never, ever, ever gave in. So he was killed because he was accused of witchcraft, but he was never found guilty of witchcraft. But he is a victim of the witch panics. If how we are going to define a witch as someone who was killed as a result of being found guilty, no. But he is someone who died because he was accused of witchcraft. And this is the thing that's really tricky about the witch panics generally. There's all these different kind of nebulous ways to think about them and think about the people who are involved. But I'm going to lay it down for you. No one who died in the witch panics was a witch. They were all just really unfortunate people. This guy was a bit of a jerk, but he didn't deserve to die for it. Giles Corey also really looms in our imagination because it's one of the named examples of a man who gets killed. And not just any man, a rich and powerful man. So, you know, men often kind of get thrown in there. For example, some of the Pendle witches are men, and they do get killed. But Giles Corey is this really upstanding kind of like pillar of the community type guy who gets killed. So we think about him a lot because he's a man, and we think of that as an outlier, which it actually was in terms of the Salem witch trials. Again, you know, more women than men, but more men than Giles Corey. Let's just put it that way. Why was Ann Putnam accused of witchcraft? She wasn't. Fun fact. Ann Putnam instead was thought to have been cursed by a witch. And there's a difference. Ann Putnam was the oldest child of Tom Putnam, who was Salem's brand new, flashy reverend who had just been brought there from Boston. She was acting out. She was not listening to her parents or obeying. She was falling on the floor and screaming and moving all around. And I don't know, in general, being an unruly 12-year-old. And it wasn't said that she was a witch, it was said that she had been cursed by a witch. So she's one of the people who really kicks off the Salem witch trials. So this is one of those things where there's a lot of people involved in the Salem witch trials. Puritans only have 5 names. People can get really confused about who you're talking about, but Ann Putnam is super, super involved, but she isn't ever accused of witchcraft. Next question. Why do witches ride brooms? It's a dick joke. Congratulations. Yeah, they're a kind of a phallic symbol, and it's a way of being like, you see, the witches with the broom riding, you like that? It's also kind of like about the subversion of femininity. So like a good woman uses the broom in order to sweep out the house. A bad woman uses the broom to go to the demon orgy. Sad face, right? So it's kind of about that. It's just a joke that kind of got out of hand that we don't understand anymore. Again, with witches and brooms, we start to see the brooms come up more often as a result of, you guessed it, your man, Albrecht Dürer, who gets those really, really involved. When we have a kind of idea and image of a witch coalesce. So it's all down to one artist, like all of our real popular interpretations of women and witches. So yeah, sometimes you would say that brooms get mentioned, for example, in earlier sources, in earlier medieval sources, with people saying, oh, do you think you're flying on a broomstick? But it's not always involved. The brooms kind of come in later. It's usually thought that people were using ointment and using the ointment to fly into the sky. It's more of an early modern thing, and it shows you the power of art and the human imagination. Why do witches have black cats? Because black cats are cute.
I love you too, but I'm not in love with you.
Oh, Sabrina.
Not until you find a new way of grooming yourself.
Mean.
Witches can have all kinds of familiars. There is this idea that after you have a sex with the devil, part of the prizes you get to take home is a familiar. And familiars can be any kind of thing. It could be a toad, it could be a little dog, or it could be a cat. And for some reason, early modern people kind of focus on cats, but more particularly, they focus on black cats. And in particular, as the modern period goes on, we put black cats in more and more often. Oftentimes when we see people talking about familiars in the sense with witches, they're not actually cats earlier on. It's all kinds of strange things. But cats are just the one that is stuck in our imagination, I think, because we kind of like cats and we want them to show up. So if we're gonna make something like a Halloween card witch now, we're gonna slap a cat in there because everybody likes to see a cat. Next question. Did witches really wear pointy hats?
Who's the baddest witch in town?
The pointy hats don't come in until a lot later, so you can't blame Albert Durer for this one. I found him guilty of a lot of witch-based crimes, but the pointy hats don't really start coming in until kind of later in the 17th century, and even more in the 19th century. It's kind of like an art trope that happens much, much later. So no, not really. We don't tend to see those at all come up in art. That's something that we like to do. Next question. Why were witches hunted? Because people are jerks. There's all sorts of reasons why the witch panics happened. There are the religious reasons of people wanting to prove a point and showing that they are very holy. There's the fact that in places where women who were killed at high numbers are involved, people really don't like women. And any excuse to kind of kill powerful ones or ones who have stepped out of place is taken on board and really, really liked. Witches might get hunted because somebody stands to make a lot of money and they want to take those lands. But they also can be hunted just from a genuine fear of the idea that there are witches who are existing in large numbers who are out to get you. So it varies from person to person and place to place, but as a general rule of thumb, it does have to do with fear, whether it's fear of just women being unruly, fear that you are not rich enough, or fear that someone is actually coming after you. Next question. No more questions. Well, it's very, very difficult to find a place to stop with witch questions, so I guess that's good as any. If you're interested in this topic and want to hear more from me about it, you can always check out my podcast, Gone Medieval, on the History Hit Network. For more about the witch trials, you might also want to check out Not Just the Tudors, which has a big look at the 16th century. But if you want more like this, you can always smash subscribe here. Check out all of our videos on History Hit, and I'm sure I'll be talking about here somewhere.